It was a cold, damp evening when he stumbled upon the thing that would change his life forever. The kind of evening where the air feels heavy, like it's pressing down on your chest, and every sound seems amplified in the stillness. He had been walking through the woods near his small cabin, a place he'd called home for years. It wasn't unusual for him to take these walks, especially after dark. Something about the quiet solitude helped clear his mind. But this night was different. The forest floor was littered with fallen leaves, their crisp edges crunching underfoot as he moved deeper into the trees. A faint mist hung low, curling around the base of ancient oaks and twisting through the underbrush like ghostly fingers. The moonlight filtered weakly through the canopy above, casting long shadows that danced unnaturally across the ground. He wasn't sure what drew him off the path. It could have been curiosity or just a gut feeling, but something compelled him to step away from the familiar trail and into the unknown. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? He didn't notice the object at first. It blended so seamlessly with its surroundings, almost as if it were part of the earth itself. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw Ita glint, a flash of something unnatural amidst the decay. At first, he thought it might be an animal skull, perhaps left behind by some predator who had dragged its meal here to feast undisturbed. But as he knelt down and brushed away the dirt and moss, his blood ran cold. This was no ordinary bone. It was too smooth, too polished, and there was something else about it. Something wrong. When he picked it up, the weight of it felt strange in his hands, heavier than it should have been. And then he heard it, the scream. It wasn't loud, not at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it filled his ears and seemed to reverberate inside his skull. It wasn't human, not exactly, but it carried a raw, primal anguish that made his stomach churn. For a moment, he froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. His heart pounded in his chest as the sound echoed all around him, bouncing off the trees and swallowing the silence whole. "What the hell is this?" he whispered aloud, though no one was there to answer. He turned the skull over in his hands, examining it closely. Its surface was marred by strange markings, symbols carved deep into the bone that looked older than time itself. They weren't random. They formed patterns, almost like writing, though he couldn't decipher them. The longer he stared at them, the more they seemed to shift and writhe beneath his gaze, as if alive. He quickly looked away, shaking his head to dispel the unsettling sensation. For reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't leave the skull there. Maybe it was morbid curiosity. Maybe it was the nagging feeling that it belonged with him now, but whatever the reason, he slipped it into his coat pocket and continued back toward his cabin. The walk home felt longer than usual, each step heavier than the last. The scream had stopped once he put the skull away, but the memory of it lingered, clinging to him like a shadow. Back at the cabin, he placed the skull on the kitchen table and stared at it under the dim light of a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The room felt smaller somehow, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, hoping the burn would steady his nerves, but it did little to calm the unease gnawing at the edges of his mind. He tried to rationalize what he'd found a freak accident, a cruel joke played by someone with too much time on their hands, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. That night, he dreamed. Or maybe it wasn't a dream. In the haze between sleep and waking, he saw felt her presence. She was there, standing in the corner of the room, watching him with hollow eyes that burned with rage and sorrow. Her mouth moved, but no words came out, only that same piercing scream that had haunted him earlier. He woke drenched in sweat, his pulse racing, convinced he wasn't alone. When he turned to look at the table, the skull was facing him directly, its empty sockets boring into his soul. Days passed, though they blurred together in a haze of paranoia and exhaustion. He stopped going into town, stopped answering calls from friends who wondered why he'd suddenly gone silent. Sleep eluded him, replaced by restless nights where he sat awake, staring at the skull and waiting for something ending to happen. And yet, nothing did. Not at first. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, barely audible over the wind outside his window, but growing clearer with each passing day. They spoke in a language he didn't understand, voices overlapping in a cacophony of despair and fury. Sometimes they sounded pleading, other times accusatory, but always urgent, as if trying to convey some dire warning. He tried covering the skull with a cloth, stuffing it in a drawer, even burying it in the yard, but it always reappeared on the table by morning, untouched and unyielding. One evening, driven to the brink of madness, he decided to confront the source of the whispers. Armed with a flashlight and a hammer he didn't think would do much good, he returned to the spot in the woods where he'd found the skull. The journey felt shorter this time, as if the forest wanted him to arrive quickly. When he reached the clearing, he dug frantically, clawing at the earth with his bare hands until his fingers bled. He didn't know what he expected to find: a body, a grave, answers, but when his shovel struck something solid, his heart skipped a beat. Beneath the soil lay the remains of a woman, her bones brittle and yellowed with age. Her jaw was missing, which explained the scream he'd heard emanating from the skull. But it was the necklace around her neck that caught his attention, a crude pendant bearing the same symbols etched into the bone. As he touched it, images flooded his mind. Fire, screams, betrayal. He saw flashes of a village burning, of people running in terror, of a woman being dragged into the woods and left to die. The visions were overwhelming, and he collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. When he came to, he realized the truth. This woman had been murdered, her death shrouded in mystery and forgotten by time. The skull wasn't just a relic, it was a vessel, a conduit for her pain and anger. She wanted justice, closure, something only he could provide. But how? How could he possibly undo centuries of suffering? Over the next few weeks, he became obsessed with uncovering the truth. He scoured old records, visited local historians, and pieced together fragments of a story that had been buried along with the woman. What he discovered chilled him to the core. The symbols on the skull matched those used by a secret sect known for practicing dark rituals. They believed that sacrificing the innocent would grant them power, immortality. The woman, whose name he eventually learned was Eleanor, had been one such victim. Armed with this knowledge, he returned to the clearing one final time. Under the light of the full moon, he performed a ritual of his own, using the information he'd gathered to lay Eleanor's spirit to rest. He spoke words of apology, of regret, promising that her story would not be forgotten. And then, as dawn broke over the horizon, the screaming stopped. The skull crumbled to dust in his hands, leaving behind only silence. But peace never truly comes without a price. Though the nightmares ceased and the whispers faded, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd merely delayed the inevitable. Somewhere, deep within the woods, the earth stirred again, ready to reveal another secret, another tragedy waiting to be uncovered. It all began on a night when the air was thick with humidity, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel heavy. The moon hung low in the sky, obscured by clouds that drifted lazily across its pale face. He had been driving through the countryside for hours, the monotony of the road broken only by the occasional flicker of headlights in his rearview mirror or the distant hoot of an owl. His destination wasn't clear. He just knew he needed to keep moving. Life back home had become suffocating, a series of arguments and disappointments that left him feeling like a stranger in his own world. So he packed a bag, got into his car, and drove. The town he found himself in was small, almost forgotten. It wasn't marked on any map he'd seen, and the sign at the edge of the road was weathered and cracked, the letters barely legible. But something about it drew him in a pull he couldn't explain, as though the place itself were calling to him. The streets were empty, lined with old brick buildings that leaned slightly as if weary from years of standing. There was a diner still open, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the darkness, and he decided to stop there, hoping for a cup of coffee and maybe some answers. Inside, the diner smelled of grease and stale cigarette smoke. A few patrons sat scattered around the room, their faces shadowed by the dim light of overhead bulbs. The waitress who approached him was older, her hair streaked with gray and pulled back into a tight bun. She didn't smile as she set a menu down in front of him, but there was a kindness in her eyes that made him feel less alone. He ordered coffee and asked if she knew of any places to stay for the night. She hesitated before answering, glancing over her shoulder toward the kitchen. "There's a bed and breakfast up the road," she said finally, her voice low and cautious. "But I wouldn't recommend it." "Why not?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. She shook her head, avoiding his gaze. "Bad things happen there. People go missing. Or worse." He laughed nervously, dismissing her words as superstition. After all, what harm could come from spending one night in a strange house? He thanked her and paid for his coffee, then followed her vague directions until he reached the bed and breakfast. From the outside, it looked harmless enough, an old Victorian-style house with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The windows were dark, save for a single light glowing faintly upstairs. He knocked on the door, and after a moment, it creaked open to reveal an elderly man with sunken eyes and a gaunt frame. The man introduced himself as Mr. Grayson and welcomed him inside without much enthusiasm. The interior was cluttered with antiques, their surfaces coated in a fine layer of dust. The air smelled musty, like decades of memories trapped within the walls. Mr. Grayson showed him to a room on the second floor, apologizing for the lack of amenities. "We don't get many visitors these days," he muttered before leaving him alone. That's when he noticed the ring. It was sitting on the bedside table, gleaming faintly in the dim light. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. A simple silver band with intricate engravings along the surface. But as he picked it up, he felt an odd sensation, a tingling in his fingertips that spread up his arm. The engravings weren't random designs. They formed symbols, ancient and unfamiliar. Something about them stirred a deep unease within him, yet he couldn't bring himself to put the ring down. Curiosity got the better of him. He slipped it onto his finger, half expecting nothing to happen, but the moment the metal touched his skin, the temperature in the room plummeted. His breath came out in visible puffs, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. A cold wind swept through the room, though the windows remained closed. And then he heard a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Panic gripped him, and he yanked the ring off, tossing it onto the table as if it were burning hot. The sensation passed almost immediately, leaving him shaken but unharmed. He told himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, the result of exhaustion and stress. Still, he resolved to leave the ring where it lay and avoid touching it again. He climbed into bed, pulling the covers tightly around him, and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of red light and heard whispers in a language he didn't understand. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they became a deafening roar that filled the entire room. He snapped awake, drenched in sweat, and realized the ring was glowing faintly on the table. Against his better judgment, he reached for it again, unable to resist the pull it exerted on him. This time, the transformation was immediate. The room dissolved into darkness, and he found himself standing in a vast, desolate landscape. The sky above was a swirling mass of crimson clouds, and the ground beneath his feet was cracked and barren. In the distance, a figure emerged from the haze, towering creature with eyes like molten gold and horns that curved upward like scythe blades. Its presence radiated malice, and he felt his knees buckle under the weight of its gaze. "You called me," the creature said, its voice resonating like thunder. "What do you seek?" He stammered, unsure of how to respond. He hadn't meant to summon anything. He hadn't even known such a thing was possible. But the demon didn't wait for an explanation. It stepped closer, its massive form casting a long shadow over him. "The ring binds us," it continued. "You wear it, and I am yours to command. But beware, such power comes at a cost." Before he could ask what that cost might be, the vision faded, and he was back in the bedroom gasping for air. The ring was still on his finger, warm now, almost comforting. For a brief moment, he considered throwing it away, burying it somewhere no one would ever find it. But another part of him, the darker, more reckless part, was intrigued. What kind of power could he wield with this artifact? Could he use it to fix the mess his life had become? Over the next several days, he experimented cautiously, testing the limits of the ring's abilities. Each time he invoked the demon, it appeared instantly, eager to grant his wishes. He started small, asking for trivial things: a winning lottery ticket, a promotion at work, revenge against someone who had wronged him. The results were immediate and undeniable. Money flowed into his bank account. Opportunities presented themselves effortlessly, and those who had crossed him suffered mysterious misfortune. But with each wish, the toll became clearer. Strange occurrences began to plague him: objects moving on their own, shadows shifting when no one was near, voices whispering his name in the dead of night. The demon's presence lingered, even when it wasn't summoned, watching him with unseen eyes. He tried to ignore it, convincing himself that the benefits outweighed the risks. But deep down, he knew he was playing a dangerous game. One evening, as he sat alone in his hotel room, the whispers returned. They were louder now, more urgent, urging him to make another wish. He resisted at first, determined not to give in to temptation, but the pressure mounted until he couldn't bear it anymore. Desperation took hold, and he called upon the demon once again. "What is it you desire?" it asked, its golden eyes gleaming with amusement. "I want control," he blurted out. "I want to be free of you, free of this curse." The demon tilted its head, considering his request. "Freedom has a price," it said slowly. "Are you willing to pay it?" "Yes," he replied without hesitation. The creature smiled, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. "Very well. Your freedom shall be granted, but know this: you cannot escape destiny. The ring will pass to another, and the cycle will begin anew." With that, the vision ended, and he found himself back in his room. The ring was gone, vanished from his finger as if it had never existed. For a while, everything seemed normal. The whispers stopped, the shadows receded, and life returned to some semblance of order. He convinced himself that he was safe, that the nightmare was over. But fate has a way of catching up with you. Months later, While rummaging through an antique shop in a different town, he stumbled upon a familiar object. There, nestled among dusty trinkets and forgotten relics, was the ring. It gleamed innocently under the soft glow of the shop's lights, as if waiting for him to claim it once more. His stomach churned as he stared at it, torn between fear and fascination. The shopkeeper noticed his interest and approached him, holding the ring delicately between two fingers. "Strange piece, isn't it?" she said with a knowing smile. "Found it in the woods years ago. Always wondered who it belonged to." He wanted to tell her to destroy it, to throw it into a fire and never speak of it again. But the words caught in his throat, and instead he nodded silently, backing away until he was out of sight. As he walked away from the shop, he couldn't shake the feeling that the ring wasn't done with him, that somehow it would find its way back into his life, dragging him deeper into the abyss. And so, the cycle continues. Somewhere, someone else will pick up the ring, unaware of the horrors it holds, unaware that they are merely the next link in a chain that stretches far beyond comprehension. It was a quiet morning when he first heard the story, the kind of morning where the world feels suspended, as though time itself has paused to catch its breath. He had stopped at a roadside diner somewhere in the middle of nowhere, a place so small it didn't even have a name on the map. The diner was old, with peeling paint and mismatched furniture that creaked under the weight of years gone by. A few locals sat hunched over their coffee cups, their faces lined with age and weariness. It was one of Thema, wiry man with sunken eyes and a voice like gravel who began to speak. "You ever hear about Black Hollow?" the man asked, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the diner's foggy windows. His tone was casual, almost indifferent, but there was an undertone of unease that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He shook his head, leaning forward slightly. The man smirked, revealing a mouth full of crooked teeth. "Guess not. Most folks haven't. That's 'cause it ain't there no more. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it there?" The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, demanding explanation. The man took another sip of his coffee before continuing, his voice dropping lower, as if afraid someone or something might overhear. "Black Hollow used to be a town, just like any other. Had a church, a school, a couple of stores. People lived there, worked there, raised their kids there. And then, one night, it vanished. Not a soul left behind. Just empty streets and houses standing like ghosts." He felt a chill run down his spine, though he tried to brush it off as nonsense. Stories like this were common in rural areas, urban legends passed down through generations, exaggerated with each retelling. But there was something about the man's demeanor, the way his hands trembled slightly as he spoke, that made him pause. "What happened?" he asked, unable to hide the curiosity in his voice. The man shrugged, his expression unreadable. "No one knows for sure. Some say it was cursed. Others reckon it was something worse, something unnatural. All I can tell you is, if you're driving through these parts, steer clear of that road. Ain't worth the risk." The warning lingered in his mind long after he'd left the diner, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts like a persistent itch. He told himself it was nothing more than a tall tale, the kind of story people told to scare outsiders or pass the time. But as he drove deeper into the countryside, the image of an abandoned town haunted by secrets began to take root in his imagination. He couldn't explain why, but he felt drawn to it, as though the idea of Black Hollow had been waiting for him all along. Hours later, he found himself turning onto a narrow dirt road, barely visible beneath the thick canopy of trees. The forest loomed on either side, its shadows stretching long across the ground, despite the late afternoon sun. The air grew cooler, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. There were no signs, no markers to indicate where the road led, but he pressed on, guided by instinctor, perhaps something else entirely. The further he drove, the more oppressive the silence became. Even the birds seemed to fall silent, leaving only the sound of his tires crunching against the gravel. Then, without warning, the trees parted, revealing a sight that froze him in place. Ahead lay the ruins of a town, its buildings crumbling and overgrown with ivy. It was as if time itself had stopped here, leaving everything suspended in decay. The church steeple leaned precariously to one side, its cross rusted and broken. Windows were shattered, doors hanging off their hinges. It was exactly as the man in the diner had described: empty, lifeless, and eerily still. He parked his car at the edge of the town square and stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. The air felt heavier here, almost suffocating, as though the very atmosphere carried the weight of whatever tragedy had occurred. He called out, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts to sound confident. "Hello? Is anyone here?" There was no response, only the faint rustle of leaves stirred by an unseen breeze. He wandered through the deserted streets, taking in the remnants of lives once lived. A child's doll lay discarded in the middle of the road, its porcelain face cracked and smeared with dirt. A newspaper fluttered in the wind, its headlines faded but legible. Local farmer reports, strange lights over woods. The date was illegible, the ink smudged beyond recognition. As he explored, he noticed something odd. The houses, though clearly abandoned, showed no signs of forced entry or vandalism. Furniture remained intact, dishes stacked neatly in cupboards. It was as though the residents had simply walked away, leaving everything behind. In one home, he found a table set for dinner, plates and utensils arranged as if waiting for guests who would never arrive. The scene sent a shiver down his spine, a stark reminder of how abruptly life could be interrupted. Night fell quickly, cloaking the town in darkness. He returned to his car, intending to leave, but the headlights refused to turn on. The engine sputtered and died, leaving him stranded in the eerie stillness. Panic began to creep in, but he forced himself to stay calm. He grabbed a flashlight from the trunk and decided to spend the night in one of the houses, hoping daylight would bring answers. The house he chose was modest, its interior musty and cold. He lit a candle and settled into a chair by the fireplace, listening to the creaks and groans of the old structure settling around him. Sleep eluded him, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Every sound outside the snap of a twig, the whisper of the wind felt deliberate, as though the town itself were watching him. Then, just after midnight, he heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too close for comfort. They moved steadily toward the house, stopping just outside the door. He held his breath, gripping the flashlight tightly in his hand. The doorknob turned slowly, inch by agonizing inch, until the door swung open with a groan. No one stood there, yet the footsteps continued, moving past him and into the hallway. Summoning every ounce of courage, he followed, his heart pounding in his chest. The footsteps led him upstairs to a room at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, spilling faint moonlight onto the warped wooden floor. Inside, he found a journal resting on a dusty desk. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with frantic handwriting that spoke of fear and desperation. "Something is coming," the first entry read. "We don't know what it is, but we can feel it. The animals have gone silent, the crops are dying, and strange lights appear in the sky every night. Pastor says it's a sign, a punishment for our sins, but I'm not so sure. Whatever it is, it's getting closer." The entries grew darker as he flipped through the pages. Families reported hearing whispers in their homes, voices calling their names in the dead of night. Livestock disappeared without a trace. Then came the disappearances first, a single farmer, then entire families. By the final entry, the writer's handwriting had become erratic, almost illegible. "It's here. We should have left when we had the chance. Now it's too late. God help us." The journal slipped from his hands, landing with a thud on the floor. He backed away slowly, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. What had happened to the people of Black Hollow? What force had driven them to vanish overnight, and why did he feel as though he were being watched? Before he could process what he'd read, the temperature in the room plummeted. His breath came out in visible puffs, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and writhe unnaturally. A low hum filled the air, vibrating in his bones and making his teeth ache. Then, from the darkness, a figure emerged, a shapeless mass of writhing tendrils and glowing red eyes. It moved, silently, gliding across the floor without disturbing a single speck of dust. He stumbled backward, tripping over the journal as he scrambled to escape. The creature didn't chase him, but he could feel its presence everywhere in the walls, the floor, the very air he breathed. It was alive, sentient, and utterly malevolent. He ran downstairs, bursting through the front door and into the night. The town was no longer silent. Instead, it buzzed with activity, though no living soul was in sight. Lights flickered in windows, laughter echoed through the streets, and the smell of smoke wafted from chimneys. But the people weren't real. They were phantoms, echoes of the past, trapped in a loop they couldn't escape. He saw them now, men, women, children, all frozen in moments of terror, their faces twisted in screams that would never reach his ears. The town wasn't abandoned, it was haunted, a prison for those who had dared to defy whatever force had claimed it. He didn't stop running until he reached his car. Miraculously, the engine roared to life, and he sped away, leaving Black Hollow behind. As he glanced in the rearview mirror, he thought he saw Movementa shadow detaching itself from the tree line and following him. He drove faster, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, until the town disappeared from view. Days later, he found himself recounting the story to a stranger in another diner miles away from where it had begun. The man listened intently, nodding as if he already knew the tale. When he finished, the man leaned forward, his expression grim. "You're lucky," he said. "Most folks who go looking for Black Hollow don't come back." He wanted to ask what the man meant, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he paid for his meal and left, glancing over his shoulder as he walked to his car. The road ahead stretched endlessly, lined with trees that seemed to close in around him. Somewhere, deep in the woods, Black Hollow waited, its secrets buried but not forgotten. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that it wasn't done with him yet. It was late, the kind of night where the world feels eerily quiet, as though it's holding its breath. He had been driving for hours, the monotony of the road broken only by the rhythmic hum of his tires against asphalt and the occasional flicker of headlights in his rearview mirror. The journey wasn't planned, nothing about it was. He'd left in a hurry, spurred on by an argument that had spiraled out of control, the echoes of raised voices still ringing in his ears. His destination wasn't clear. All he knew was that he needed to get away. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? The motel he found himself at was tucked off the highway, barely visible behind a cluster of overgrown bushes and a faded sign that read "Vacancy" in flickering neon letters. It wasn't much, but it would do. The building itself was old, its paint peeling and its windows clouded with grime. A single bulb buzzed faintly above the entrance, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. He stepped inside, greeted by the smell of stale cigarettes and damp carpet. The man behind the counter looked up briefly, his eyes hollow and uninterested, before sliding a key across the desk without a word. His room was small, cramped, and dimly lit by a single overhead light that flickered intermittently. The walls were thin, the faint murmur of a television drifting through from the adjacent room. There was a bed, a rickety wooden chair, and a dresser topped with a dusty mirror. He set his bag down and glanced at his reflection, half expecting to see the same tired face staring back at him. But something felt off. The mirror seemed darker than it should have been, as if it were swallowing the light rather than reflecting it. He shook his head, dismissing the thought as exhaustion creeping in. After tossing his jacket onto the bed, he splashed some water on his face in the tiny bathroom. The mirror there was even worse, its surface marred by streaks of dirt and what looked like decades of neglect. Still, he couldn't help but glance at himself again, trying to shake the unease that had settled in his chest. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. His reflection moved. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow shifting across the glass. But Noah was deliberate. His reflection tilted its head slightly, a movement so subtle he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest, and stared harder. The figure in the mirror smiled a slow, unnerving grin that didn't belong to him. His own lips remained still, frozen in shock. "What the hell?" he whispered, his voice trembling. He reached out instinctively, pressing his hand against the cool surface of the mirror. The reflection did the same, but then it didn't stop. Its fingers curled inward, scraping against the glass as if it were trying to claw its way out. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet and landing hard on the tile floor. When he looked up again, the reflection was gone, replaced by his own wide-eyed expression. For a while, he sat there, clutching his knees to his chest and trying to convince himself it had been nothing more than fatigue playing tricks on him. Mirrors distorted reality sometimes, right? That's what he told himself as he stood shakily and turned off the bathroom light. Back in the main room, he poured himself a drink from the mini-fridge, hoping the alcohol would calm his nerves. But sleep wouldn't come, no matter how many times he closed his eyes or tried to focus on the hum of the air conditioner. Hours passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, he decided to leave. He grabbed his bag and headed for the door, pausing only to glance once more into the dresser mirror. His reflection stared back at him, perfectly still this time or so, he thought. As he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of movement behind him in the glass. Slowly, reluctantly, he pivoted back around. The reflection was standing there, clear as day, even though he was facing it directly. It wasn't mimicking his movements anymore. It was acting independently, tilting its head and studying him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Its eyes glinted in the dim light, sharp and calculating, as if it could see straight through him. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey. All he could do was stand there, paralyzed, as the reflection took a step forward. The sound it made when it stepped out of the mirror was indescribably wet, tearing noise, like fabric being ripped apart. The air around him grew colder, his breath visible in the suddenly frigid room. The figure stepped fully into the real world, its form solid and tangible, yet somehow wrong. Its features were familiar, undeniably his own, but twisted into something alien. Its smile widened impossibly, revealing rows of jagged teeth that shouldn't have fit inside a human mouth. "You've been running?" it said, its voice low and guttural, layered with whispers that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within. "But you can't escape yourself." "Who are you?" he managed to choke out, backing away until his back hit the wall. "I'm you," the creature replied, taking another step closer. "Or rather, I'm what you've buried. Every lie, every secret, every mistake. You locked me away, and now I'm free." He shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. "No, this isn't real. None of this is real." The thing laughed, a sound that sent chills racing down his spine. "Real enough to hurt you." With that, it lunged, its hands wrapping around his throat with unnatural strength. He struggled, clawing at its fingers, but it was no use. The pressure increased, black spots dancing across his vision until everything went dark. When he woke, he was lying on the floor, the room bathed in pale morning light. For a moment, he thought it had all been a nightmare, vivid, terrifying dream brought on by stress and exhaustion. But then he noticed the scratches on his neck, raw and angry, and the faint imprint of fingerprints on his skin. Panic surged through him as he scrambled to his feet, searching the room for any sign of the creature. It was gone, leaving behind only the lingering sense of dread that clung to him like a second skin. Over the next few days, he became increasingly paranoid. Shadows seemed to move when he wasn't looking, and mirrors took on a sinister quality, their surfaces rippling as though alive. He avoided them whenever possible, covering the ones in his apartment with sheets and refusing to look at his reflection in store windows. But avoidance only worked for so long. One evening, as he brushed his teeth in the bathroom, he caught sight of himself in the mirror. At first, everything appeared normal. Then, slowly, his reflection began to change. Its eyes darkened, its smile widening into that same grotesque grin he remembered all too well. It leaned forward, pressing its palms against the glass, and spoke without moving its lips. "I'm still here." He dropped the toothbrush and backed out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind him. His hands shook as he fumbled for his phone, dialing the number of a friend who lived nearby. She arrived within minutes, her brow furrowed with concern as she listened to his frantic explanation. Together, they searched the apartment, checking every corner and closet, but found nothing unusual. Still, she insisted on staying the night, unwilling to leave him alone. As they sat on the couch, talking quietly to distract themselves from the tension in the air, he heard the faint creak of the bathroom door opening. His blood ran cold, and he turned to see the reflection standing in the doorway, its form flickering like static on an old television screen. His friend screamed, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the exit. They didn't stop running until they reached her car, speeding away from the apartment as fast as they could. In the weeks that followed, he sought help wherever he could find it: psychologists, spiritual advisors, anyone who might offer answers. Some dismissed his claims as delusions, while others suggested rituals meant to banish malevolent spirits. Nothing worked. The reflection continued to haunt him, appearing in unexpected places and growing bolder with each encounter. It taunted him, feeding on his fear and guilt until he could no longer distinguish between reality and madness. Eventually, he realized there was only one way to end it. Returning to the motel where it had all begun, he confronted the reflection in the same grimy bathroom mirror. "If you're really me," he said, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through him, "then you'll understand why I have to do this." The reflection smirked, its eyes gleaming with malice. "You'll never be rid of me." "Maybe not," he replied, pulling a shard of broken glass from his pocket. "But neither will you." Before the creature could react, he slashed the mirror, shattering it into countless pieces. The reflection let out a piercing shriek, its form dissolving into smoke as the shards clattered to the floor. For a brief moment, he felt relief, a fleeting sense of peace. Then, as he stared at the fragments scattered around him, he noticed something unsettling. In every single piece, his reflection stared back, smiling wider than ever before. And this time, it wasn't alone. It all started with a letter, the kind that arrives without warning and changes everything. The envelope was plain, its edges slightly worn from travel, bearing no return address, but her name scrawled across the front in shaky handwriting she didn't recognize. She tore it open absent-mindedly, expecting junk mail or some bureaucratic notice, but what she found inside stopped her cold. It was a short note written in ink that had faded to a pale brown over time. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? To my dearest descendant, it began. If you are reading this, then I am long gone, and you have inherited more than just my belongings. Among them is a Mirroran heirloom passed down through our family for generations. Be warned, it is not merely glass and silver. Treat it with care, for it holds secrets best left undisturbed. The letter ended abruptly, signed only with an illegible flourish. She stared at it for a long moment, her mind racing. A mirror? What could possibly be so significant about a mirror? Her grandmother had always been eccentric, prone to superstitions and cryptic warnings, but this felt different, more urgent, somehow. Curiosity gnawed her, and by the time the package arrived a few days later, she was both eager and apprehensive to see what lay inside. The delivery man struggled to carry the crate up the steps of her apartment building, muttering under his breath about how heavy it was. When she finally pried it open, the smell of aged wood and dust filled the room. Nestled within layers of yellowed newspaper was the mirror, framed in ornate carvings that twisted into shapes resembling thorny vines. Its surface gleamed faintly, despite the grime coating its edges, as though it had been waiting patiently for her arrival. She cleaned it carefully, wiping away decades of neglect until it shone like new. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. Every now and then, she'd glance at the mirror, half expecting to see movement behind her reflection. But there was nothing unusual, just the familiar contours of her face staring back. Still, the unease lingered, a quiet hum beneath her thoughts that refused to fade. That night, sleep eluded her. She tossed and turned, her dreams fragmented and disjointed. At one point, she woke with a start, certain she'd heard a whisper coming from the living room where the mirror stood propped against the wall. Shaking off the sensation as paranoia, she rolled over and tried to drift off again. But the whispers persisted, growing louder and more insistent, until they formed words she couldn't quite make out. Unable to ignore it any longer, she padded barefoot into the living room, her heart pounding in her chest. The apartment was dark, lit only by the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the blinds. The mirror loomed before her, its surface reflecting the dim light in strange, uneven patterns. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then, slowly, her reflection shifted. At first, it was subtly tilt of the head, a slight change in posture, but then it stopped mimicking her entirely. Instead, it raised a hand, pressing its palm flat against the glass, as if trying to push its way out. She gasped, stumbling backward until she hit the wall. Her reflection smiled a slow, predatory grin that sent chills racing down her spine. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Her reflection didn't answer. Instead, it stepped forward, emerging from the mirror as easily as stepping through a doorway. Its form shimmered for a moment, translucent and wavering, before solidifying into flesh and bone. It looked exactly like her, yet wrong in ways she couldn't articulate. Its eyes were too sharp, its smile too wide, its movements unnervingly fluid. "You shouldn't have touched me," it said, its voice layered with echoes that seemed to reverberate inside her skull. "Now we're bound." "What do you mean?" she stammered, clutching the edge of the couch for support. "I am your shadow," it replied, tilting its head as if studying her. "The part of you that hides in the dark, the pieces you wish no one would ever see, and now, thanks to your meddling, I'm free." Before she could respond, it lunged, moving faster than she thought possible. Its hands closed around her throat, pinning her to the wall as it leaned in close. She struggled, clawing at its fingers, but it was impossibly strong. Just when she thought she couldn't take another second, it released her, stepping back with a satisfied smirk. "This isn't over," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "I'll be watching." And then it was gone, vanishing back into the mirror as if it had never existed. She collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, her pulse pounding in her ears. For a while, she sat there, staring at the mirror and waiting for it to move again. But it remained still, its surface calm and unbroken. Over the next several days, she tried to convince herself it had been a hallucination brought on by stress or lack of sleep. Life returned to some semblance of normalcy, at least outwardly. But inwardly, she was unraveling. Shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, and every reflective surface carried the weight of suspicion. She avoided mirrors whenever possible, covering the one in her bathroom with a towel and refusing to look at store windows as she passed. Yet, no matter how hard she tried to forget, the entity never let her rest. It appeared in fleeting glimpses at the edge of her vision, in dreamlike sequences that bled into reality. Sometimes, it would whisper her name, its voice soft and taunting. Other times, it would mimic her movements in the mirror, distorting itself into grotesque shapes that made her stomach churn. Each encounter left her more shaken than the last, until she could barely function. Desperate for answers, she delved into her family's history, searching for clues about the cursed object she'd inherited. What she discovered chilled her to the core. Generations ago, her ancestors had dabbled in practices, better left untouched rituals, meant to bind spirits to objects, trapping fragments of their essence within. The mirror had been created as a prison, a vessel designed to contain the darkest parts of those who gazed into it. Over time, however, the bindings had weakened, allowing the trapped entities to seep out and prey on the living. Armed with this knowledge, she resolved to destroy the mirror. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The thing inside was cunning, feeding on her fear and guilt to grow stronger, but she had no other choice. Gathering supplies, she drove to an isolated stretch of forest far from prying eyes. Under the cover of darkness, she set the mirror on the ground and surrounded it with salt, chalk symbols, and candles. Her hands trembled as she lit the wicks, the flames casting flickering shadows across the clearing. The ritual was simple yet painstaking, requiring her to recite words in a language she didn't fully understand. With each syllable, the air grew heavier, charged with an energy that crackled like static electricity. The mirror's surface rippled as if disturbed by an unseen wind. Then suddenly, her reflection emerged once more, its expression furious. "You think you can banish me?" it snarled, its voice amplified to a deafening roar. "I am part of you. You can't escape yourself." "I'm not trying to escape," she replied, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "I'm ending this." With that, she hurled a shard of broken glass at the mirror, striking it dead center. The impact sent cracks spiderwebbing across its surface, and the creature let out a piercing scream, its form dissolving into smoke as the mirror shattered into countless pieces. For a brief moment, silence reigned. But it didn't last. As she gathered the shards, preparing to bury them deep in the earth, she noticed something unsettling. In every fragment, her reflection stared back, smiling wider than ever before. And this time, it wasn't alone. It was a cold night, the kind where the air feels sharp against your skin and every breath you take seems to crystallize in front of you. He had been walking for hours, his boots crunching against the frost-covered pavement as he made his way through the dimly lit streets of a town that felt more like a ghost than a living place. The town wasn't one he recognized. It wasn't on any map he'd seen, and yet here he was, drawn to it by forces he couldn't explain. His mind was heavy with thoughts of failure bills piling up, relationships crumbling, dreams slipping further out of reach with each passing day. He was desperate, though he hated to admit it even to himself. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? He found himself standing outside a small shop tucked into an alleyway, its sign crooked and barely legible. It read simply, "Curiosities." The windows were dark, but faint light spilled from cracks around the door, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Something about the place called to him, not in words, but in a pull deep within his chest, as though the shop itself were alive and beckoning him closer. Against his better judgment, he pushed the door open, the bell above it jingling softly. Inside, the shop was cluttered with Auditesian old clock that ticked backward, jars filled with unidentifiable objects suspended in murky liquid, shelves lined with books whose spines bore no titles. The air smelled of dust and something faintly metallic, like blood or rust. A man stood behind the counter, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. His eyes gleamed unnaturally bright in the dim light, and when he spoke, his voice was low and smooth, almost hypnotic. "Looking for something specific?" the man asked, tilting his head slightly as if he already knew the answer. I'm not sure," he stammered, glancing around the room. I need help." The shopkeeper's lips curled into a faint smile. "We all do, don't we? But help comes at a price. Are you willing to pay?" He hesitated, unsure of what to say. The desperation gnawing at him outweighed his caution. "What kind of price?" The man chuckled softly, leaning forward until his face emerged from the shadows. His features were sharp, almost too perfect, as though carved from stone. "Not money," he said. "Something far more valuable. Your shadow." "My shadow?" he repeated, incredulous. "What use could anyone have for my shadow?" "Oh, you'd be surprised," the shopkeeper replied, his tone dripping with amusement. "Shadows carry weight, you see. They hold pieces of us, the doubts, the fears, the parts we try to hide. Give me yours, and I'll give you what you truly desire. Wealth, power, freedom, it's all within reach." For a moment, he considered walking away. The whole thing sounded absurd, like some twisted fairy tale meant to scare children. But the promise of relief was intoxicating. He thought of the debts he owed, the arguments that left him feeling hollow, the endless cycle of disappointment. What did he really have to lose? "Fine," he said finally, his voice trembling despite his attempt to sound confident. "Take it." The shopkeeper's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp to belong to a human. "Very well, step into the light." Confused, he obeyed, moving toward a single beam of moonlight streaming through a crack in the ceiling. As he stood there, the shopkeeper produced a small vial filled with shimmering liquid and uncorked it. He muttered words under his breath, their meaning lost in the strange cadence of his speech. Then, without warning, the man snapped his fingers. A searing pain shot through his body, starting at the base of his spine and spreading outward like wildfire. He cried out, clutching at his sides as the sensation intensified. When he looked down, he saw Ethan's shadow writhing on the ground as if it were alive. It stretched and twisted, resisting whatever force was pulling it away from him. Slowly, agonizingly, it detached itself from his feet and floated upward, dissolving into the vial the shopkeeper held aloft. The pain subsided as suddenly as it had begun, leaving him gasping for air. "There," the shopkeeper said, capping the vial and tucking it into his coat pocket. "It's done. You're free." At first, everything seemed normal. He stepped outside, expecting to feel lighter, freer, but instead, he felt empty. The world around him looked different, somehow flatter, as though colors had been drained from the landscape. People passed by without casting shadows of their own, their forms oddly distorted in the lamplight. He glanced at the ground, searching for his reflection. But there was nothing. No shadow followed him anymore. Over the next few days, the changes became impossible to ignore. Without his shadow, he felt disconnected from reality, as though he were floating just above the surface of the world. Strangers avoided him, their eyes sliding past him as if he weren't there. Even mirrors refused to show his likeness, reflecting only blank spaces where he should have been. Worst of all, he began to notice things moving in the corners of his vision shapes that darted away whenever he turned to look. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, little more than murmurs carried on the wind. But soon, they grew louder, clearer, until he could make out distinct voices speaking in languages he didn't understand. They surrounded him constantly, pressing in from all sides, filling his mind with chaotic noise. Sleep became impossible, replaced by restless nights spent staring at the ceiling while the voices argued and screamed. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, the whispers coalesced into a single voice that sounded eerily like his own. "You shouldn't have sold me," it said, low and menacing. "Now you'll never be rid of me." He whipped around, searching for the source, but the room was empty. The voice laughed, a sound that sent chills racing down his spine. "I'm everywhere now, and I'm coming for you." Panic gripped him, and he fled the apartment, running blindly through the streets until he reached the shop where it had all begun. The door was unlocked, swinging open with a creak as he stumbled inside. The shopkeeper was waiting for him, seated calmly behind the counter as though he'd expected this visit. "Change your mind?" the man asked, raising an eyebrow. "You need to fix this," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Take it back. Whatever it is, I don't care. I can't live like this." The shopkeeper sighed, shaking his head. "Once a deal is made, it cannot be undone. You traded your shadow for power, remember? This is the cost." "But I didn't ask for this," he pleaded, tears streaming down his face. I just wanted things to get better." "And they will," the shopkeeper replied, his tone almost sympathetic. "In time, you'll learn to embrace the darkness. Until then," he gestured toward the door. "Run, hide, do whatever you must. But know this, your shadow will always find you." With that, the man disappeared, leaving him alone in the silent shop. He ran again, faster than before, fleeing into the night. But no matter how far he went, the whispers followed, growing louder and more insistent with each step. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, twisting and writhing as if mocking him. and in every reflective surface he passed, he saw it the shape of his former self, grinning cruelly as it closed in. Eventually, he collapsed, exhausted and broken, on the side of a deserted road. The whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. For a moment, he thought it was over, that perhaps he'd finally escaped. Then, slowly, the ground beneath him began to darken. A shadow loomed over him, larger and darker than anything natural, its form shifting and pulsing like smoke. "You belong to me now," it whispered, its voice echoing in his ears, "forever." And with that, the darkness swallowed him whole. It was a quiet afternoon when he stumbled upon the camera, the kind of day where the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground like skeletal fingers. He had been rummaging through the attic of his late uncle's house, a place filled with forgotten relics and dusty memories. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and old wood, and every step he took sent clouds of dust spiraling into the dim light filtering through the cracked window. His uncle had been an eccentric man, known for his fascination with the occult and strange artifacts, but even by his standards, this item stood out. "Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there?" The camera was old, its body worn and scratched from years of use. It looked like something from another era, a relic of a time before digital screens and instant gratification. A strip of film peeked out from the back, curled slightly at the edges, as though it had been left there for decades. There was no brand name or label, just a series of cryptic symbols etched into the metal frame. Something about it felt wrong. Not broken, exactly, but alive in a way that made his skin crawl. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the object before finally picking it up. The weight of it surprised him. It felt heavier than it should have, as though it carried more than just its physical form. He turned it over in his hands, inspecting it closely. The lens was cracked, and the viewfinder was clouded with grime. But otherwise, it seemed functional. A small slip of paper was tucked inside the compartment where the film was stored. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a single sentence scrawled in faded ink. "Do not develop the last photo." His curiosity got the better of him. He loaded the camera with the remaining film and stepped outside, aiming it at random objectry, a chair, the horizon, and snapping pictures until he reached the final frame. Each click of the shutter echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness, reverberating in his ears long after the sound had faded. When the roll was complete, he brought it to the local photo shop, ignoring the uneasy feeling growing in the pit of his stomach. The photos came back the next day, printed on glossy paper that shimmered faintly in the light. At first glance, they appeared normal blurry images of mundane things captured through a cracked lens. But as he flipped through them, one picture caught his attention. It was the last photo on the roll, and it wasn't what he had expected. Instead of the backyard fence, he remembered photographing. The image showed a figure standing in the distance, obscured by shadow. Its face was indistinct, but its posture was unmistakable, silhouette frozen mid-step, arms outstretched as if reaching for something. He stared at the photo for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Who or what was in the picture? And why did it feel so familiar? The longer he looked, the more details emerged. The figure's outline began to sharpen, its features taking shape in ways that defied logic. Then, with a jolt of recognition, he realized it wasn't a stranger at all. It was him. But that wasn't the worst part. Behind the figure, barely visible in the background, was a date written in stark white letters against the dark sky. A chill ran down his spine as he read it aloud. 3 days from now. At first, he laughed nervously, dismissing it as some kind of prank or glitch in the camera. Cameras didn't predict the future, they captured moments, nothing more. Still, the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts like a persistent itch. Over the next few hours, he tried to distract himself, burying the photo in a drawer and focusing on other tasks. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. That night, sleep eluded him. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside the window set his nerves on edge. Shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, pooling in corners and flickering in the periphery of his vision. Just as he was beginning to drift off, he heard a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere in the house. It started faintly, almost imperceptible, but grew louder and more insistent with each passing second. Heart pounding, he rose from bed and followed the sound, moving cautiously through the darkened halls. The tapping led him to the study, where the camera sat on the desk, untouched since he'd brought it home. Its lens gleamed faintly in the moonlight, streaming through the window, as though it were staring at him. Next to it lay the photo, face up, the date glowing faintly, as if illuminated from within. Before he could react, the room plunged into darkness. The bulb overhead flickered once, twice, then went out completely, leaving him blind. Panic surged through him as he fumbled for the light switch, his hands trembling. When the lights finally came back on, the photo was gone. In its place was a new imagone he hadn't taken. It showed the same figure, clearer now, standing closer. Its face was still obscured, but its presence loomed larger, dominating the frame. The date remained unchanged. Over the next 2 days, the photos continued to appear. Each morning, he would wake to find a new image waiting for him, the figure inching closer with every iteration. Details became sharper texture of its clothes, the curve of its outstretched handas, though it were stepping out of the photograph and into reality. By the 3rd day, the figure filled the entire frame, its face just inches away from the lens. Its eyes, though hidden beneath shadow, seemed to bore into his soul, radiating an intensity that made his chest tighten. Desperate for answers, he returned to the attic, hoping to find some clue about the camera's origins. Buried beneath piles of books and papers, he discovered a journal belonging to his uncle. Its pages were filled with cryptic notes and sketches, detailing experiments involving photography and the supernatural. One entry stood out. The camera sees beyond the veil, capturing glimpses of what is yet to come. Beware, the final frame it reveals the truth we are not meant to know. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a camera. It was a tool designed to glimpse the future, to peer into the void between life and death. And now, it had chosen him as its subject. On the morning of the predicted date, he woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The room was silent, eerily so, as though the world itself were holding its breath. He checked the study, half expecting to find another photo, but the desk was empty. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to hope that maybe the curse had ended, that he had somehow escaped its grasp. Then, the knocking began. It started softly, a series of rhythmic taps against the front door. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. Slowly, reluctantly, he made his way downstairs and opened the door. No one was there. Just as he was about to close it, he noticed something lying on the porch, a single photograph, fluttering gently in the breeze. He picked it up, his hands shaking as he turned it over. The image showed the interior of his house, specifically the living room where he now stood. In the center of the frame was the figure, fully formed and unmistakably real. It stood facing the camera, It was a cold, damp evening when he stumbled upon the thing that would change his life forever. The kind of evening where the air feels heavy, like it's pressing down on your chest, and every sound seems amplified in the stillness. He had been walking through the woods near his small cabin, a place he'd